Well, hello, Syma. It's been a bit of a while, but we're back with season two.
Yeah, we certainly are. I'm really looking forward to it and excited to be back. How are you, Tim?
No, I'm really good. It's been I think both of us sort of got a bit swamped with having to do other things than the podcast, sadly. It'd be nice just to do the podcast like once, once a week, but yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I think we're back. We've got some exciting plans,
And some
and
exciting guests.
yeah, absolutely. And it's yeah,
But I
ready
think
to
we'll
go.
probably do a little bit slightly longer ones where we kind of hopefully dig into a little bit more detail and just release them once a month.
Yeah, I think so. And as always, we're very keen to get feedback from our listeners and viewers on
Yeah.
existing podcasts or ideas for guests.
So what science have you been up to anyway over the last little while, or have you just been busy teaching, going to conferences?
My glamorous lifestyle.
Yeah, yeah, no, exactly.
Um, Actually, I went to a really interesting conference in Kobe in Japan, where people were talking about using AI to simulate the movement of molecules and the sort of things they can predict in future. So, with sort of really high accuracy, how drugs, potential therapeutics might bind to their targets, things that now you in the future you'll be able to do with AI. So that was really interesting.
Won't that put you out of a job?
No, I think not. I think not because as we talked about in the past when we speaking various things about AI, it can learn things, but does it understand things? There's always that sort of gap, and I think that'll keep some of us in a job for a while, hopefully. How
I
about
mean, it's
yourself,
really
Tim? Sorry.
that whole AI thing. I know we're not going to talk about AI on the podcast today when we get our guest on, but I think it's really interesting because, there are some really impressive machine learning tools out there that do specific tasks incredibly well. And I mean, we code some of those up I say we, that's the broad we, but my excellent postdoc Willem kind of links artificial neural networks to partial differential equations, and then trains them on data that we're confident on. But I think I don't know if I don't use ChatGPT very often, but the last few times I've dived in and used it, I think it's actually I mean, its language abilities are astonishing, but I think the information it's getting are getting worse. I'm just wondering if it's sort of retraining itself on more, or every time it's retrained, it's on the internet, and there's so much rubbish out there. It's just giving really unreliable answers.
Yeah, probably. I mean, there's going to be a huge level of curation of data, proper annotation of data in the future, and yeah, the accuracy of a lot of these AI methods will depend on that, I think.
No, I think that's right. So in fact, I have to admit, I hardly ever use ChatGPT for these reasons. I can't remember what it did the other day, but I was asking it something I knew the answer to,
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, it was way off the mark, and it wasn't like something particularly hard.
Yeah, I've used it to sort of find bugs in my own code sometimes. Sort of pasted things in and said, why doesn't this work? Or why isn't it doing what I think it's doing? And it's been pretty good at that, to be honest. That's been about the extent.
Yeah, maybe I should. I've been coding today for the first time in a while, and I've hit something I'm struggling to debug, and we started recording this just as I think I was about to crack it, but it'll have to wait till
Oh
tomorrow
no.
now. So, but it's quite. I have to admit, I do quite like writing code, and what I'm trying to do, I'm working with a guy called Pete Hudson, who we had on the
Yeah.
podcast a while ago, actually, and we're trying to understand about spillover of viruses from bats and rats. And it's one of his students, Caitlin, who's actually leading on at this, and they sort of said, "Oh, could you do a model for us?" And so I said, "Yeah, that'll be easy." Thought, "Oh, you'll be able to rattle that off quite quickly." But yeah, I'm obviously a bit rusty coding, but I'm not going to turn to Chat GPT because I'm not sure it will help actually.
Oh, okay, fair enough. I think that's when it comes to coding, I'm rubbish at coding, so that's the first place I go to these days.
So anyway, what else have you? How's the research going? You've been off to a conference. Exciting papers coming out.
Yeah, it's all happening. It's things cooking up and papers in the pipeline. still on the quest for trying to understand what the surface of bacteria looks like. But hopefully, watch this space. We might have some details soon. I won't give away too much right now. But
Ah.
how about yourself? You've been away with work, haven't you?
Been away, a bit of work and a bit of holiday. I had a meeting in Australia, so I've got this big grant at the moment where we pulled all the collaborators together, and that was really good fun. Enjoyed that, and then had to pop over to Puerto Rico to see another collaborator, where we were a couple of collaborators who were working on a paper. But then I've had a holiday, and it's kind of a bit like a busman's holiday here because Sonia and I went over to Vancouver Island and we sort of camped in the middle of nowhere with some friends, but also with a cook, which made life easier. And washing out of a bucket and all that sort of stuff. And we were on the lookout. We were hoping to see something called the coastal wolf, which is a subspecies of wolves, which are really interesting. So most wolves eat elk and deer and things like that, large kind of herbivores. But these deer get nearly all of their food from the ocean. And so they're about 50% of their prey are sea otters, are those animals that everyone loves because they sort of sit there on their back
Yes.
going like this. Anyway, the wolves really like them as well. And they will. The sea otters are pretty hopeless on land, and so the wolves will. But they haul themselves out a bit like seals, and so they'll go to haul out sites, and the wolves will try and kind of get them on the haul out sites. Anyway, they also eat dead whales and dead seals that wash ashore, but they'll also kind of hunt a few mice and occasionally crunch up sort of mollusks that they find on the tidal floodplain. So they're much smaller than normal wolves. Anyway, we went to look for them. We went out with a guy called Tom McPherson, who's an expert on these wolves. He was the one who was kind of showing us around. So it was a bit of hiking through the old growth forest, sitting around waiting for the wolves to come out with telescopes and large camera lenses and what have you. And we got some excellent sightings, and of course, mucking around in a boat looking for them. So we got some excellent sightings. We were there with some good friends. So it was, and I know that I go off to look for wolves sometimes for work, but it's quite fun.
Yeah, I think we're both fortunate in that sense, aren't we? That we sort of, for both of us, work is also fun.
No, exactly,
It does
exactly.
both things.
No, I think that's right. Well, today we've got on a medic, but also a scientist and also a writer. So a guy called Robin Choudhury. And he's gonna hopefully tell us a bit. So I think it's really interesting. So a lot of kind of medical scientists, they kind of have multiple jobs almost. So they'll work in a university department as Robin does, but they're also clinicians. So I think he's stopped doing surgery now. He used to do heart surgery to sort of keep people alive by clearing arteries and what have you. But he also runs a research group. But he also, as we'll learn, is very interested in art. So anyway, should we get him on?
Yeah, absolutely. Hello, Robin. Welcome to Science of the Times.
Well, thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be with you. Um, my name is Robin Choudhury. I'm a cardiovascular clinician scientist, a professor in Oxford, and an active clinician. And I have a research laboratory that focuses on innate immune function in relation to cardiovascular disease.
Can you unpack that a little for our readers? So innate immune function. So our heart gets attacked by viruses and bacteria and things, and different people have different levels of immunity passed down from their parents, from their mother.
Well, that is true. The heart can be attacked by viruses and bacteria, but that's not what I work on. So the immune system turns out to be a bit of a misnomer. The immune system is in some sense a universal system of homeostasis. That's to say, it not only fights bacteria and viruses, but it comes into action in all sorts of disturbed biology, pathology, and it tries to fix it. So we're interested in understanding how the immune system can be harnessed to fix this problem of atherosclerosis, this narrowing of arteries that causes heart attack, and also how it orchestrates the response to myocardial infarction, heart attack, how the immune system might be reprogrammed to help regenerate the heart rather than allow it to repair itself through harmful fibrosis.
Excellent. So if you succeed, does this mean I can give up exercise and eat large amounts of fatty food?
Tim, you must make your own choices. I wouldn't recommend that.
But I mean, there would be some treatments potentially to mean that people don't have to have open heart surgery to clear arteries. Is that
right? So the things that drive this form of cardiovascular disease, the furring up of arteries, cholesterol that becomes deposited, lipoproteins that become deposited in the walls of arteries, and that sets in train a series of inflammatory responses. And those inflammatory responses, if you like, get out of hand. They become maladaptive. And so the aspect of immune function that we're interested in is how we can reharness the inflammation to try and make those cells less harmful, less inflammatory, and more reparative. And the particular area that we're interested in is how diabetes reprograms bone marrow stem cells, which are the originator cells of the immune cells we're thinking about, in ways that lock them into harmful pro-inflammatory programs and prevent them adopting this reparative capacity. And that, in turn, we think addresses a long-standing paradox in cardiology, which is that diabetes clearly drives macrovascular, coronary artery in particular, disease. But treating sugar, which is the mainstay of diabetes, lowering glucose, doesn't have an effect or doesn't have any straightforward effect on reducing that risk. In other words, something gets locked in. The sugar's bad, but treating the sugar doesn't fix the problem. And we think at least part of that problem is immune mediated.
so? How do you go about doing that? Do you design drugs? I mean, because it's quite difficult to get to a point when you can start putting drugs into people. So, I mean, do you use sort of machine learning to devise drugs and then try them in other animals and then eventually move through to human trials? The reason I ask about machine learning, we've had a few people on the podcast in the past who have been designing drugs using known protein structures and what have you.
Yeah, so in the first place, we need to try and understand the disrupted processes. So where we've got to at the moment is in determining at least some of the epigenetic programming that occurs as a result of persistently high levels of glucose. So in other words, the proteins that determine which genes get expressed are fundamentally altered in the bone marrow. Now, in those bone marrow progenitor cells, that sets in train a whole cascade of potentially targetable secondary processes. So the DNA alters its conformation. That's the primary change in response to so-called histone modifications. And that accessibility changes the genes that are transcribed. In turn, there are messenger RNAs, there are proteins, all of which come down that pathway. Now, the intervention might occur at the level of the epigenetic reprogramming, but that might turn out to be too big an ask. But on the other hand, if you can understand what's at the tail end of that pathway, it may be possible even to repurpose drugs. So we identify patients in whom these processes are active, and we say, well, actually, that drug's going to work if only we could identify that patient. And so it's bringing together a variety of different strands of understanding in order to deliver a therapy, which might involve ultimately developing new drugs, but that's not necessarily the case.
Yeah, so I think sort of work a little bit in this area. I think one of the hardest aspects of sort of drug development or discovery is really that target identification, right? I mean, I think sort of sometimes people can say, well, why is it so hard to develop a drug? You know what's wrong. But the point is that there's many, many different pathways and multiple players. And oftentimes we have no idea what we're targeting, let alone what the drug should look like.
Right. So I think particularly for something broad like inflammation, which is a term which is really in this context not fit for purpose, it could have many, many manifestations. So understanding not only the process, but the cell types and the location in which that process is active is really key. And the other thing I would say is that in biomedicine, there's a sense in which we're not short of drug targets. People talk about identifying new therapeutic targets, and in many areas, we've got really sophisticated understanding of the biology and how we might target it. And the gap is in understanding the patients in whom those processes are active so that you can do a clinical trial at an appropriate scale and demonstrate the efficacy. And in this world, that we're talking about, that's currently a real problem.
And so, how's progress going? I mean, it's exciting research. You tell us what what you've been doing. Are you, any particularly exciting things? And you might not be able to talk about them, of course, because you might be thinking, I've got some IP here that could be bought by various companies. But yeah, anything you can tell us, is progress
Well,
good at the moment?
I tell you anyway, I'm sure. No, I tell you something very interesting. That we've just got a paper which I believe is about to be accepted in a very final revised form. So Kate Bowden in my lab has described a core transcriptomic signature of something called trained immunity. So it turns out that the effects of glucose on these bone marrow cells are not unique to glucose. So there are certain other exposures, diet, chemical, inflammatory, infective, and they seem to be funneled through a unifying response. And these innate immune cells behave in a similar way and potentially a cumulatively similar way, whatever these exposures are. So you might say, why does that matter? Well, if they're remembering a lifetime of exposures to bad stuff, as it were, that ultimately we know impacts on atherosclerosis, that at some level is a bit depressing to learn, but it also, of course, has the potential to identify an integrated super risk factor.
Mhm.
And if you can identify that, then you have the potential to correct a whole bunch of bad stuff that's been remembered by these stem cells. So we're very excited about that because we now describe the signature, and that allows us to go and find out what's determining and what's writing that signature into the epigenome.
Oh wow!
Wow.
So if are you doing? I mean, you're a clinician as well. So you mentioned this at the, and I have to say, I've always got a huge respect for medics who are conducting research, but are also running clinics and what have you. And I think I'm right in saying that you've recently decided to step back from the surgery, but you're still running a clinic weekly. One of the aims is presumably to reduce the amount of, to improve longevity, but also to increase the frequency decrease the frequency with which surgery has to happen. That would be an outcome you'd be happy with, presumably?
Yeah, absolutely. So, for a long time, well over 20 years, I was treating the end stage consequences of this furring up process with balloons and stents. But we know that outside the context of acute heart attack, where the vessel is blocked off with a blood clot, just treating those narrowings really makes little or no difference at all to a patient's outcome. It might relieve symptoms, but it doesn't prolong life.
Oh, okay.
And really, the way to make an impact at scale is to try and deliver preventive therapies. So we think about this in terms of primary prevention. That's to say, trying to prevent the disease process occurring in the first place or to slow it down dramatically. And then in terms of secondary prevention, so someone's had a manifestation of atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, how do we deal with that and minimize the chance of recurrence? And it turns out that if you want to do that effectively, you do it with medicines, not with mechanical intervention.
And so, sorry, Syma.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, and at the moment, heart disease is one of the biggest killers that we have in certainly in the developed world, up there with cancer. There's kind of cures coming online for cancer. There's cures coming along as you're talking about for many of these heart issues, will that mean we'll all be able to live forever in like 20 years' time?
Well, look, there've been massive changes in cardiovascular mortality related to smoking cessation, control of blood pressure, cholesterol reduction, and so forth. Most of those are age adjusted. So it's not that they're not happening, it's that it's happening
At a later
later.
age. Yeah, okay.
So I agree with you. I think we're living in an absolutely exhilarating time in biomedical science. Things are changing at enormous speed. We're now putting in a grant proposal. By the end of the grant, we're using techniques that we hadn't heard of, or perhaps that weren't developed at the beginning. So it's moving extremely quickly, and our ability to harvest data at scale and to analyze it is breathtaking. The ability to communicate and collaborate with external labs and experts is extraordinary. So I think all bets off, and the idea that we might understand how to reprogram cardiovascular disease, vessel inflammation, bone marrow in a way that in fact, I've just come off a call where we've been talking about this using cellular therapies and the way that the cancer doctors are using for CAR T therapies. I think that's, you know, very plausible.
Wow, that's really exciting. I have to say, Robin, Tim does have an unhealthy obsession with living forever. And I think he's put some nefarious plan to take over the world.
This is
Well, I
not
think
true, but I do seem to say a line like that on many podcasts.
You
That's
really
true.
do.
Yeah, no, that is true.
So, Robin, your interests in the heart are not sort of confined to sort of very medical aspects, but you're also interested in depictions of the heart. And you've written this wonderful book, The Beating Heart, which Tim and I have both read. So I was wondering if you could just introduce the book for us and sort of your motivation.
well, that's very kind. Thank you. Well, from time to time, people would ask me why I became a cardiologist. And the answer at some level was pretty simple because the heart's the most important bit. And I sort of grasped onto that as a teenager, and I wanted to become a heart doctor even before I wanted to be a doctor. But it took me an embarrassingly long time to really contemplate why I thought the heart was the most important bit. And the tipping point was probably one of my colleagues in Balliol gave me a book called The Medieval Heart. So Eleanor Lombardi, who is a interdisciplinarian in her own right and an expert in Dante and love and desire in medieval poetry, gave me this book by someone called Heather Webb. And that really exposed me for the first time to the way that people have been thinking about heart over centuries. And I became very interested in it. About 10 years ago, we put on a symposium at the Ashmolean with Jim Harris, who's a teaching curator there. And there was clearly enormous public interest in this concept of the heart and what it represented and how we think about it and how we depict it. And as I started to delve a bit deeper, it became clear that everybody from Aristotle to Descartes to Leonardo da Vinci, Pascal, Aquinas had all had an idea about what the heart does and critically how it beats and what the significance of the heart is as a source of the soul, the seat of life, emotion, and repository of deeds, and all sorts of things that are recurring across time and place. And in brief, it turns out that people have depicted those beliefs in the most extraordinary ways. And I know I sort of subtitled the book Botticelli to Banksy, but actually it's far more than that. But it does span indeed Botticelli to Banksy.
The actual subtitle's the art and science of our most vital organ, I think, and it's published by Apollo, isn't it? And available at all good independent booksellers, I'm sure, and also other booksellers. But we like to champion the independent ones, and it really is a fantastic read. And people have been fascinated by the heart because and I think you make this kind of point in the book, because it moves and because it beats, right? That seems to be the source of all movement, and one of the narratives that runs throughout the book is the journey of scientific and understanding, but also of representation and culture, of how that beating heart kind of leads to soul, to life, and what have you. And so when you and you talk. When I picked up the book to read it, I thought it was primarily going to be about the science, and of course, you tell that scientific story. But actually, I was fascinated by the journey that you take us through art as well. And you just kind of, mentioned this from Banksy to Botticelli. I mean, is that something that's always interested you? You said you're going back to this Ashmolean exhibition, or is it something? Which bit? I suppose what I'm trying to say, and did you find it easier to write about the art or easier to write about the science of the heart in the book? Which bit came most naturally, or are they both easy?
Well, visual arts have been a lifelong passion. So I have no formal training in art, but I've spent, the last 40 years in art galleries, and I have a lot of exposure. So you'll have to tell me, Tim, whether or not it came across as that I wrote more easily about art or science. But I'll tell you that I really enjoyed delving into the art, and I went to some lengths to try and dissolve the distinction between the two, because of course that came relatively recently. And so people were thinking historically about their hearts in a way that it just wasn't divided in the way that we would do so naturally now. Now, Aristotle was thinking about the heart as a life source when he lifted the flap on a fertilized egg and saw the heart beating on the surface of the embryo. He was trying to integrate all sorts of thinking about life and soul and philosophy of life, and it was all coming together and melding. And it wasn't really until much later, Leonardo, perhaps at the beginning, certainly in the Enlightenment, that people start making this division between what we might think of as the art and the science. And another theme that I hope I bring forward in the book is that, and I'm certainly not trying to diminish what we believe about the heart through some sort of scientific revelation. The very strong point is that even as the science develops and we understand it more and more, we still absolutely cling to this humanity and this idea about the heart. And it's absolutely replete in our literature, idiom, poetry, and of course in street art. And, I have a very large collection of street art images, which are really a re-articulation of the way the heart's been regarded for thousands of years.
And sort of, is that universal across sort of, all the art, sort of the artists we've mentioned so far are particularly sort of Western artists. Do you find that there's this sort of the same across the globe?
I wouldn't say it's the same across the globe, but there are different types of interest and fascination. So if we go to India, for instance, you can read about ideas in the Upanishads that are very similar to Western ideas. You can see images in Kaligat art of Raman and Sita inhabiting the heart or the chest of Hanuman. So there are similar ideas that come out, and really quirky ones sometimes. So, the Upanishad speaks as the heart as the source of semen. Well, that also, to my astonishment, was also an early Western idea. And I could show you an image, in fact, it's in the book, of Leonardo connecting up the plumbing of the brain to the male genitalia, referring to this idea that's where the semen's coming from. So there are some really odd ideas as well as some perhaps more natural ones, and they do indeed recur.
I particularly like the idea of the Aztecs thinking that it was also a part of the sun, right?
Yes, and cutting out the heart from a living person and
Yes.
reuniting the life force with the sun god. Yeah, that's a gory one.
Appeal to me. I don't know.
And then there are some, it wouldn't be fair to imply it's everywhere. I think, the sort of traditions in Africa, I look quite hard. I think it's pretty hard to find it there, but the traditions there are perhaps, and I don't want to generalize too egregiously, but, it might be more an agrarian fertility type representation of art in, tribal art. Or if you go to China and to Chinese medicines, the whole concept of Chinese medicine is not based around a physiology in the way that we would understand it. So if you go to Chinese texts of medicine, they'll be much more based on flora and herbal preparations, and it's just conceived in a completely different way. And yet you can also see early Chinese woodcuts and Japanese woodcuts of heart images. So there was some fascination, but it wasn't perhaps woven as deeply as it is into Western thinking.
And if you look within a culture, so whether it's Indian, whether it's Chinese, whether it's Western, how has the depiction of the heart changed as our scientific understanding of it has changed? Is there a correlation or not?
Well, I don't think there's a simple correlation, but in fact, it's very messy because the heart motif, as we understand it, has been around for a very long time and it's debated. And I go into the book as to some of the potential origins of that motif, and clearly whether there's a direct lineage from some of the early depictions to how we show it now in the I Love New York type motif. I don't know, and I certainly can't show. But it's been around in that form for a long time. And then there's some really crazy stuff in a sense that goes on. So, the early anatomical descriptions of the heart and depictions of the heart, and I'm thinking of 16th century Italy now, seep over into the sacred depictions of the heart in the Catholic Church. And that, of course, has a great proliferation through the Novo-Hispanic world. The Jesuits adopt the heart in the cult of the Sacred Heart. And we can think of artists like Frida Kahlo who have had that, direct exposure to Catholic art, but also to the Mesoamerican art. So it's all very complicated and bound up. And I think what's interesting is what distills out, because it's not organized and it's not structured in many ways, but these heart motifs, both in the carnal heart, the anatomical heart, but also in the heart motif, persist simultaneously. And you'll find actually the emojis on your phone contain both anatomical hearts and beating hearts of all descriptions with little wings on and yellow hearts and black boxed hearts and purple hearts. There's all sorts of things in there, and you can figure out what they might mean for you.
And so do you, sort of in terms of okay, say if we stick to the Western kind of world and the depictions, are there sort of are there step changes in the way things sort of the depictions marry up with scientific knowledge, do you think, or are they sort of completely, do they sort of go parallel and not sort of intersect?
I think the latter. I don't think it's not as if the scientific understanding doesn't suddenly change the way either that we depict or the way that we think about the heart. I mean, clearly it does medically and physiologically, but in terms of the humanity of the heart and its really core, and of course the word core is derived from cor cordis, heart. So at its core, the way that we think of the heart is, I would argue, pretty similar. And as a consequence, the way it's depicted in art is pretty similar.
And are you an artist yourself, Robin?
Absolutely not.
Okay. And I mean, one of the reasons I'm asking this is because I think one of the things that I found really interesting in your book, like many scientists, many medics, we like art. You're much more knowledgeable about art than I am, particularly around, probably about all art, to be perfectly honest. But the two fields, art and science, are often don't come together. And I think one of the really nice things you do in your book is the way you do bring them together and you weave them together and you explain the history of our understanding of how it works, but also the history of depiction and the role that it's played in culture and what have you. As you were researching this book and you were learning more about the artistic side, the cultural side, did it change the way that you thought about the heart from a scientist or a medical perspective? Is it, and where I'm getting at with that, is this something that we should all be thinking about? Should I be going back and looking at the way that nature has been depicted over the eons in different cultures? And would that help me understand it better? God, that was a deep question.
Well, I think, yes, I do my best. I mean, I think in answer to the first part of it, I think I elaborated my understanding of how we see the heart culturally. So remember, the beginning of the story was I had a certain idea. I'd somehow absorbed a a notion of what the heart was, and it's important. Right? It's important. I don't know where that came from. And the significance to me as a doctor is that clearly my patients have the same. So when people come to see me with sick hearts, I think there's an overlay of real concern about their heart, about their well-being that they perhaps wouldn't get from, an ingrown toenail or right? I mean, there's something about the heart. And so, I've tried to, I mean, perhaps it's made me a little bit more of an empathetic doctor, trying to understand not only the problems with the heart, but that it really comes attached with some deep anxiety and concern for some people about the significance of the heart. And sometimes I get asked about heart transplantation in this context, and how do people with heart transplants respond to when this organ with all of these deep connotations is switched over. And I can't answer that with any authority, but certainly the way that people perceive their hearts is changed at the time of transplantation, because although the plumbing is reconnected, the nerves are not. And so some of the perception of one's heart is changed.
And in a way, I mean, talking about transplants and such like, of course, you can have a heart transplant, but you can't transplant your brain, for example. So in a way, we are more, what we are perhaps is more our brain than our heart. But that's not how we think of it, right? We still tend to think of it as heart. It's an odd thing in a way.
Yeah. And that oddness, I mean, although I sort of mischievously, play with that, I mean, that goes back a long time. That's Aristotle and Plato. So Plato is, that's the brain is the core, and Aristotle focuses on the heart. So that dichotomy goes back a very long way. But it's interesting that despite exactly the situation you describe, we still go back to the heart, and our language is largely related to the heart, heartbreak, heartfelt, broken hearts, and I don't have to expand it. And it's because I think that we have this relationship with this organ that is autonomous. It exists in some sense apart from us, and it responds. It has this sentience that allows it to respond to things that we're engaged with, and it reports to us. When you're in love or when you're in fear, you feel your heart pounding. And that's a very special relationship that we don't have with our brain or our pancreas or our toes.
That's right. So we can feel our heart in the way I can't feel my spleen.
Yes, and your heart is telling you something. You're not telling it to do that.
Yeah.
It's telling you.
And of course, that's one of the themes from the science side of trying to work out why it beat on its own. And we know the answer to that question now. And I think that the person who solved that, Dennis Noble, is at the same college as you in Oxford. And I think you've got quite a nice story about discussing his findings with him. You mentioned it in the book.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, you're right, Tim. That the question about how the heart beats is the one that had really hung over the ages. And I hadn't appreciated that. That was something that came out very much from the book. And indeed, it's why it's called The Beating Heart. And when Descartes heard of Harvey's description of the circulation of the blood, he said, yeah, well, sure, I get that. But you've got a much bigger problem. And this is the domain of God. And that's how the heart beats for itself. And Dennis Noble, as you know, in the 1960s, unpicked this. And I had the great privilege of interviewing him in a Zoom call in lockdown. Because I'd known the story. I've known Dennis for a long time. He's been a teacher of mine and a mentor. But I'd never really asked him if he understood the significance of his finding as a graduate student before he had his PhD in the early 1960s, in the context of all this that had gone before, these thinkers that had addressed the problem before. And of course, Dennis was very modest in his recollection and, of course, denied that he attached to it quite the significance that I did. But it was great to hear that story, and he very generously shared it with me in some depth that I recount in the book.
And I think people should buy the book to read that story clearly, and all not just that story,
I
but
think,
the whole book. So
and to see the artwork is phenomenal, right? I highly recommend. Just, I mean, I was gobsmacked just looking at, and Robin, I heard you speak at the Woodstock Literary Festival a couple of years ago, which is sort of, maybe you remember where I got sort of hooked on the artwork. But that sort of, what's your favorite depiction of the heart that you've sort of uncovered while you've been researching the book?
I really like the Giovanni di Paolo of St. Catherine, exchanging our heart with Christ. And I mean, it's just a beautiful image. It's in the Metropolitan Museum in New York. It's about the size of a TV screen. Well, I suppose that doesn't mean much it's about the size of my TV screen. So it's not very big. It's not very big. It's about the size of a Broad Street newspaper, perhaps a little bit smaller. And it's beautifully, it's just a very elegant piece, but it also captures a lot of the story of the heart, this idea that the heart is a container. St. Catherine wrote very eloquently about in a political, persuasive political letter to Pope Urban, trying to reconfigure the church's position in relation to a sort of top-down control versus a nourishing, heart-like role, nourishing the flock, as it were. And so she uses the heart very persuasively. The image is really very beautiful, and probably if you push me for one, that would be the one. But there are many. I love the Leonardo. We got very involved in the Leonardo drawings, the annotations of the valves. I think there are about 80 images in the book, and they're all there, having been distilled out from a much larger number.
and do you have any future writing plans? Are you going to do the kidney next, or no, I'm teasing. I know you're not, but well, I imagine you're not. But yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, I do have some. I would, as I said to you earlier, what I really enjoyed about this was the art and discovering what we can learn about the way we see the world, if you like. It's not too pompous. Our humanity, rediscovered through the depiction of this single organ. I mean, it really is a cultural history told through the depiction of this single organ, and it reflects the sacred, the secular, scientific, artistic development. So something around that I've started to play with a little bit, because I found that just so fascinating first time round.
Well, good luck with that. And we're running out of time, so I think it's really just to say thank you very much for joining us, and to tell our listeners, to remind them that Robin's book, so by Robin Choudhury, is The Beating Heart, The Art and Science of Our Most Vital Organ. It's published by Apollo, and it's available in Kindle, on audiobook and hardcover. And is the paperback out yet, or is it out later this year?
Yeah, so it's published by Head of Use, which is an imprint of Bloomsbury, and there is a relation to Apollo. I'm not sure what that. It's certainly related to a publishing label, Apollo. Hardback's out and still available, and the paperback comes out early next year.
Early next year. Okay, well that's to look forward to, and I can thoroughly recommend it, as I'm sure can you, Syma.
Yeah, absolutely, and we'll include a link with the podcast episodes.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Robin. Thank you for joining us.
No, you're very kind. Thank you both.
Well, that was really nice. I'll tell you what I think I liked about it is, we think of art and science as separate. And I do like the way that he weaves those two things together, because, as scientists and possibly medics, I guess we have a sort of tendency to think of the science as more important than the art. And of course, it does produce cures, or drugs or what have you, but that kind of, we shouldn't devalue the art side of it, because culturally, obviously, it's incredibly important.
Yeah, absolutely, and as he sort of talked about, also the way it's made him think, maybe also as a clinician, the art side of it is just immensely important to people, the way we think, the way we act, the way we feel. And it's interesting that despite what we know about the science, it hasn't changed that much the way the depictions have progressed. And so that shows in itself the value of the art to us as humans, right?
No, it's true. And I was wondering, and I don't know if anyone's done it, but thinking of my field about how aspects of ecology are depicted. I mean, there are some species, animal species that, have been in art right since the beginning, since the first paintings that people have put on cave walls, whether they're lions or bison or things like that. And perhaps that hasn't changed much either as our understanding of them. Well, maybe we don't know very much about them anyway. Maybe that's it.
Yeah, I don't. It's difficult, isn't it? I don't know, but maybe the bigger things are. It's easier to change the way we, is depictions become perhaps. I don't want to say sophisticated, but more anatomically correct. Thing with the heart is we don't see the heart, right? It's hidden, and so perhaps I don't know.
Mm.
Perhaps there's a difference in the things that we see every day and things we can't.
But we can't see many molecules every day, and you've got some pretty interesting pictures on your board behind you. I can't work out what they are.
They're not molecules.
No, they're not. Okay. I thought they might be abstract molecules.
Well, the way my research has gone today, my molecules are abstract.
I mean, has the way that, presumably the way, well, maybe are molecules depicted much in art? I don't know.
Um, could I mean, I guess, the fundamental molecule, water, is depicted, right?
That's true.
And ideas of water. Yeah, I don't think they have changed too much because, we know a lot more about water than we did before. So, for example, we know there's very many different types of ice. There's not just one type of ice. There's many different forms of ice, but yet that hasn't changed the way, it's depicted. I think, yeah, I honestly don't know, actually, in the wider context, are molecules depicted other than water?
I mean, I remember, an artist printing out, and actually it was really interesting to see the full human genetic code,
Yeah.
when they'd done that, we've got the human genome. They printed it out. And I mean, it's staggering just to see how much space it takes up, right? When it's written out just one letter after the other. I mean, it wasn't a belter of a read, to be honest, just those four letters. Yeah. But no, it was pretty impressive. I mean, you realize just how much information is in the genetic code, I remember.
Yeah. I mean, I guess we see DNA itself depicted as this double helix. And, even now, even though we know, we have a major groove and a minor groove, you still see depictions where it's almost just two strands
Yeah, yeah.
entwined around each other. So
Well,
yeah, it's interesting.
particularly in logos,
Yes.
you see it, and I remember I used to work at a conservation organization that I won't mention, but the Institute of Zoology in London, for a while had had as its logo a strand of the double helix of DNA with some sort of primate or a bush baby kind of
Yeah.
climbing it up. But the way they'd drawn it made it look like the bush baby was committing suicide on this double strand of DNA. Anyway, I'm waffling on, but we should probably wrap it up because I'm sure no one's listening anymore. But it was that was really interesting. I enjoyed that, and we're going to be back sort of monthly or so. So we will have an exciting guest for a
Yes.
month's time, but it's great to be back. It's been really fun doing this again, I have to
Yeah,
say.
absolutely. And we'll put sort of sneak previews on social media to give people hints as to who the guest might be.
That's a good idea.
And
Excellent.
so yeah,
Yeah.
folks, yeah, keep an eye out on Blue Sky and Instagram, etc. We'll be dropping hints soon.
Yeah. Fantastic. Brilliant. Well, great to see you, Syma, and let's catch up soon.
Absolutely. Take care, Tim.
Yeah. Okay. Bye.
Bye.